He's alive! He's alive!
Hey guys, it's Fawn. Growing up, I've always enjoyed movies and shows surrounding all things magical or supernatural. I remember watching My Babysitter's a Vampire, Wizards of Waverly Place, and Monster High. All of these shows familiarized me with the lore of supernatural creatures without me ever diving into the source material. So without having ever read Dracula or Gilgamesh, I knew vampires avoided the sun and required human blood for sustenance. I knew werewolves would turn into beasts under the full moon and could only be killed by silver bullets. And I knew that Frankenstein was some guy made by a scientist who was, big and kind of ugly, I guess. Frankenstein is definitely the outlier among what I would consider the famous supernatural figures. In fact, the most prominent representation of Frankenstein that I remember in my childhood was Frankie Stein from Monster High, who was just a quirky teen girl who was curious about the world around her. In fact, the most recent prominent depiction of Frankenstein's monster in media that I could find was in 1935. While other creatures, for example vampires, have had many successful adaptations since their film debut. In the 2010s, there was Twilight, Vampire's Diaries, etc. And even now, we have 2022's Interview with a Vampire, which I just finished watching and would definitely recommend. But this leads me to a new question. Why hasn't Frankenstein had the same popularity or revival as other creatures? And if it did, what would that look like today? In 2022's Interview with a Vampire, although the story is about blood-sucking monsters and creatures that feast upon humans, there's a much deeper message about power and abusive relationships, class, and race. Vampirism is a tool used to dive deeper into the themes that I just mentioned. It poses a question, what if there was a black man in the 1930s Louisiana who had the abilities of a vampire, and what would he do with them? What if there were two men who were vampires in this era, and what would their relationship entail? For this video, I want to explore how Frankenstein can be retold, as well as how we can use the themes of Frankenstein to relate to audiences today, and how to keep these moral questions that the novel poses alive and relevant. Just a disclaimer, I am aware that there are many other movies and infinite shows that do reference Frankenstein, since it is one of the most popular pieces of literature and most influential pieces of literature on the planet. However, there hasn't been an outright popular remake with the exact same characters and the exact same plot that I could find in any recent movies or TV shows. Essentially, this is for fun, and we're just imagining here, so come along with me and see where we go with this.
A new species would bless me as its creator and source. Many happy and excellent natures would owe their being to me. No father could claim the gratitude of his child so completely as I should deserve theirs.
For those of you who haven't read Frankenstein, I'll give a quick recap on the source of all the novel's problems and who the book is named after, our lovely protagonist, Victor Frankenstein. At the beginning of the book, Victor is between the ages of 17 and 19. He lives in a big family with his father, his mother, his younger brother, and his cousin, who was raised as his sister, Elizabeth. Victor is portrayed as a pretty intelligent and curious person at the beginning of the novel. He and his siblings had been homeschooled their whole lives, therefore their education was done completely by their father. That's important. Skipping ahead to the most interesting part of the novel, what leads Victor into the act that we all know him for, which is creating the monster. At the age of 17, he leaves his family in Geneva to attend college in Ingolstadt, which is his first time receiving a formal education. This doesn't go well for Victor, and his professors begin talking down to him because they believe the education he received was lackluster. He was reading these occult type of books and had a very strange education that was not in line with the education from his other peers had received growing up. This causes Victor a lot of inner turmoil because he felt embarrassed, humiliated by his professor, and in an act to prove himself and save his ego, he uses the knowledge that he's gained from his upbringing in order to create the monster that we all know and love today. The novel doesn't go into much detail about how he did it, but I think one thing that the movie is missing is acknowledging that Victor is not some experienced mad scientist. He is a 17-year-old boy whose ego has been terribly bruised, and his intelligence has been questioned, which was the aspect of himself that he valued the most. This leads him to do one of the most immoral and horrifying acts one can think of, reanimating the dead. He isolates himself. He robs a bunch of graves in order to build an abomination to prove that he can do something nobody else can. I think in this new interpretation that we're imagining, It would benefit us to portray Victor as childish, as he doesn't think about the gravity of reanimating the dead. He only wants to prove himself, which is pretty characteristic of people of his age group. He doesn't have the maturity to sit down with his feelings and process them. Eventually, his excessive pride is shown to be hubris, and he creates the worst beast imaginable. And not only that, another thing that should be mentioned is that Victor does not take responsibility for the creation of the monster. He lets it roam the earth for 2 years before he does anything about it. And that is only because the monster begins killing his family members and harming the people he cares about. And even then, he refuses any type of help. In terms of looks, I imagine him to be slim. He comes off as more brainy than athletic, so I think that his build should reflect that. I imagine that he would have nice clothes considering he lived with his mother and Elizabeth, who care a lot about him. Therefore, I'd imagine that anytime he have anything wrong with his clothes, they would fix it up for him. I also think that the bags under his eyes would show the many sleepless nights that he spent on the creature, and maybe even reading glasses, because spending a lot of time squinting at notes in the dark is notoriously bad for your vision.
Where did all of it begin? Was it there? No, it doesn't matter where. Everything happened as I willed it. Everything.
I have written myself into good spirits, dear cousin, yet I cannot conclude without again anxiously inquiring concerning your health. Dear Victor, if you are not very ill, right yourself, and make your father and all of us happy. Or, I cannot bear to think of the other side of the question. My tears already flow.
Oh, Elizabeth. Poor girl. Elizabeth is Victor's cousin, however, their relationship could be more comparable to siblings, because Elizabeth was raised by Victor's family after the death of her own parents. However, it's expected by everyone that Victor and Elizabeth be married. Gross, I know, but apparently cousin marriages were normal back then in Europe, and the family tree was more like a family wreath. Elizabeth is essentially the perfect societal ideal of femininity. She's loving, cares for the family without nagging or being annoying, and is always worrying about Victor's well-being. Although, due to the perspective of the novel being Victor's, she lacks a lot of depth. In this imaginary adaptation of ours, I want Elizabeth to still embody the traits that she had in the novel, especially since it's partially from Victor's perspective. However, I think it would be interesting to break the angelic and inhumane view that Victor has of Elizabeth and humanize her a bit. If you're unaware, the creation of the monster led to the murder of Victor's baby brother, and Elizabeth's best friend Justine was framed for the crime, leading to her execution. As you may have guessed by now, rather than take responsibility for the monster or let people know about it, Victor simply watches as Justine is tried and executed, despite knowing for a fact she is innocent. Elizabeth strongly believed that her best friend would never murder a child, despite all the evidence pointing to her being guilty. She confided in Victor, and he too agreed that Justine was innocent. I think the death of Justine should lead to Elizabeth becoming suspicious of Victor, and doing some investigating on her own without his knowledge, because surely someone who has known him his entire life would be able to tell when he's hiding something. So in the presence of Victor, she would be this image of femininity and purity. However, when she's alone, we would see a more authentic side of her. In terms of appearance, I want Elizabeth to resemble Victor's mother, because the book makes it very clear there's a bit of an Oedipus complex going on with Victor. She should be conventionally attractive for that time period. Healthy, clear skin, a weight that suggests her family has enough money that she is well fed, and clothes that are nice but not extravagant, and large expressive eyes.
And this is it. This is the part where the character never recovers. The part where life takes them down. This is the scene that scars her forever.
Of my creation and creator, I was absolutely ignorant, but I knew that I possessed no money, no friends, no kind of property. I was besides endued with a figure hideously deformed and loathsome. I was not even of the same nature as man. I was more agile than they, and could subsist upon coarser diet. I bore the extremes of heat and cold with less injury to my frame. My stature far exceeded theirs. When I looked around, I saw and heard of none like me. Was I then a monster, a blot upon the earth from which all men fled, and whom all men disowned?
I've thought a lot about how I personally would portray the monster in this fun little fantasy where we create our own adaptation. The monster is definitely my favorite character by far. I'm 1000% Team Monster. He may have, committed a few evil acts, a little murder here and there, but somehow he manages to remain the most sympathetic character. What is key to the monster's character is how he's pure at his birth. He smiles at Victor, and Victor forsakens him, yet he still attempts to connect with people, even after being abandoned by his creator. He develops a parasocial relationship with his family, and learns how to speak from watching them through their window, and when he tries to connect with them, he gets attacked for his monstrous appearance. He saves a little girl from drowning and gets shot at. Then he tries to befriend Victor's little brother, and even still, a child calls him a hideous beast. The child tells him that he is from the Frankenstein family, and after several years, this is what leads him to snap, a reminder of the creator who abandoned him. I think the monster should be portrayed with a childlike innocence at first. He's incredibly sensitive and incredibly humble in the beginning, acknowledging that he's hideous, crying because he wants to be human and experience the joy of connection. The monster is relatable in this way because he's denied the most basic things that we all need, deserve, and desire: a home, safety, and loved ones. He even offers to run away and never interact with humans ever again if Victor is willing to grant him a wife, an equal who can understand him and he can connect with. Even at the end of the novel, when he eventually kills Victor, he sobs because he didn't want his relationship with Victor to end this way. In our adaptation, the monster should be hesitant and a remorseful killer. When he eventually kills Elizabeth, I want them to have a conversation about Justine and Victor before he reveals himself, then kills her once he sees the fear in her eyes. In terms of his appearance, one of my favorite passages in the novel is the one in which the monster is born. Victor says, "How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe? Or how delineate the wretch whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavored to form? His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful, great God. His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness. But these luxuriancies only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost of the same color as the dun white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips." What I like the most about this is that he initially thought of the monster as beautiful, making sure to select the perfect parts, before realizing how ugly and uncanny he looked due to him literally being created from corpses. So, as the passage stated, I would portray him with long, stringy, wavy black hair. I think instead of bright green skin that we are most familiar with, the yellowish skin tone of a dead person is absolutely necessary. He'd also be huge and strong, as somewhere it's mentioned that the monster is about 8 feet tall, but I think his build should still be very muscular and almost Adonis-like, since Victor took the time to pick the prettiest, or maybe freshest, parts when making him. I think something that's a definite must is that Victor and the monster must look alike in some way. Maybe the eye color or a specific facial feature, but I think it would be a great way to remind the audience that Victor is responsible for his birth, and that Victor is his father, technically, and his creator.
I created you. You created me. I made you into a hero. You made me into this. Look at me!
The novel starts off with a series of letters from a brother out at sea to a sister. The second letter reads, "I have hired a vessel, and am occupied in collecting my sailors. Those whom I have already engaged appear to be men on whom I can depend, and are certainly possessed of dauntless courage. But I have one want which I have never yet been able to satisfy, and the absence of the object of which I now feel as a most severe evil. I have no friend, Margaret. When I am glowing with the enthusiasm of success, there will be none to participate my joy. If I am assailed by disappointment, No one will endeavor to sustain me in dejection. I shall commit my thoughts to paper. It is true, but that is a poor medium for the communication of feeling. I desire the company of a man who could sympathize with me, whose eyes would reply to mine. You may deem me romantic, my dear sister, but I bitterly feel the want of a friend. This sentiment is reiterated by the monster later on. He says to Victor, "And what was I? Of my creation and creator, I was absolutely ignorant, but I knew that I possessed no money, no friends, no kind of property. I was, besides, endowed with a figure hideously deformed and loathsome. I was not even of the same nature as man. I was more agile than they, and could subsist upon coarser diet. I bore the extremes of heat and cold with less injury to my frame. My stature far exceeded theirs. When I looked around, I saw and heard of none like me. Was I then a monster, a blot upon the earth from which all men fled and whom all men disowned? Where Frankenstein could shine in modern day is exploring themes of having all this information at your hands but being completely isolated and lonely. We've all experienced this to an extent due to recent world events, but also due to our hyper-individualistic society. And part of what causes all of Victor's issues is his sense of hyper-individuality and his lack of regard for others. For example, not telling the truth and letting Elizabeth's best friend die, putting his family in danger, and letting his brother be murdered by the monster. I think our society is seeing how hyper-individualism is harmful lately, with people reaching out and seeking therapy more often, or some men expressing their feelings more freely with their friends. And this theme being reiterated in Frankenstein would relate to a lot of people. If you watched and made it all the way to the end, I want to thank you so much for watching my first video and supporting my channel. Thank you. See you next time.